My name is Katie Bateman. I am a professional learning and research manager with the Museum of Science, Boston, in our pre-K-12 division. So we work with schools, particularly in the K-8 sector. And then I am joined today by Dr. Corey Miller from Michigan State University and Create for STEM. I'm introducing you if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm an assistant professor in the teacher education program at Michigan State and work in Create for STEM, which is a research institute in the College of Ed.
All right, so we're here today to talk about collaboration and resilience, fostering socio-emotional learning in STEM. And we're using STEM because Corey and I kind of come from a little bit of two different worlds. I work predominantly in engineering and she's in science, but we know that some people may have some other visions of the acronym of STEM, but we're going to go with that today to talk about both. And so first we want to just talk about what is socio-emotional learning. What do we mean when we say that? So it's become a really big interest area in K-12, even K-16. We hear it in higher ed as well, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and social distancing. So creating opportunities for students to develop their abilities to have better intra and interpersonal relationships, empathize with others, and be good collaborators. These are all things that are crucial to both their academic success and just being a good person and citizen. So we think about learning from a sociocultural perspective, which means that learning happens when students are working with others to build knowledge, that collaboration is key. Knowing how to work with others is a big part of that. So in this webinar, we're going to use the CASEL framework, which is this big circle that you see on the screen on your right, to think about the aspects of socio-emotional learning. And there's 5 of them that they identify as the major ideas: self-awareness and self-management, social awareness and relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And we're going to get into those in a little more depth as we go through here. But we also want to talk about, why is this important? Why should we care? We keep hearing these words, right? A lot of us in our professional development, in the media, all these things. The research around socio-emotional learning has shown that there are academic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal outcomes, all of them valuable for students' whole being development. Academically, the research reports that students are more engaged, they perform better in math and science on standardized tests, and those students who have socio-emotional learning in school have greater rates of high school graduation and even college graduation rates. So in terms of relationships with others or those interpersonal skills, students had greater empathy for others, and schools saw a reduction in bullying and aggression in their schools. And for students' personal outcomes, again, those intrapersonal experiences, they reported feeling more safety and support, and there was less anxiety and depression reported in the schools.
Today, we're going to be focusing on 2 elementary curricular resources, and we're going to talk about the social-emotional learning skills, but we also want to remember the importance of STEM. Engaging young children in STEM not only fosters critical thinking and problem-solving skills, but it also cultivates a deep understanding of everyday phenomena, and nurturing a science identity in young children not only enriches their educational experiences, but also equips them with the essential skills and the perspectives needed for success in our increasingly complex driven society and technologically driven society. But more importantly, though, in my mind, STEM is also necessary in igniting students' curiosity and wonder, and it fosters that joy for learning, which hopefully will follow them throughout their school career.
We want to take just a moment to talk about the difference between K-12 science and K-12 engineering. So in our K-12 schooling, we look at both of these as being good for teamwork, for testing and manipulating materials, arguing from evidence, and engaging in problem solving. However, the goals of each are a little different. Science seeks to generate knowledge about the natural world. Engineering solves problems by producing man-made technology. Now, in the world of professional practice, those lines get a little more blurry. Science generates knowledge to use in engineering devices. Engineering creates knowledge, creates devices to collect data and allow science to generate knowledge. They're both important. They both have their place, and they're often tightly pulled together. But for our purposes today, we want to delineate those two slightly different goals and objectives. And so to do that, we're going to look at these two open source curricular resources that we will share exactly how to get to these resources at the end of the presentation. But we're going to look at a science curriculum that came out of Create for STEM called Multiple Literacies in Project-Based Learning, and an engineering design challenge curricula from the Museum of Science called Youth Engineering Solutions. One is project-based learning, one is an engineering design challenge, but they are both classroom tested. They are both NGSS aligned. They are research-based. And as I said before, they are open source, which we know is really important. So you do not have to pay to access either of these curricular resources. And so Corey is going to tell us a little bit about PBL and MLPBL in particular. You're muted, Corey. Somehow you got muted.
Multiple literacies in project-based learning curriculum is developed around this project-based learning framework where students are pursuing answers and solutions to meaningful questions. We call them driving questions. And for example, one of them is, why do I see so many squirrels, but I don't see any stegosauruses? So students engage in scientific practices and three-dimensional learning to figure out why this phenomena occurs. And throughout the unit, students are collaborating with each other. They're participating in experiences scaffolded by their teacher to create artifacts and use disciplinary science ideas to explain why we no longer see stegosauruses in our neighborhoods. So they're really meaningful experiences for students, and it's really exciting to see their outcomes from these units. When we developed the curriculum, both equity and social-emotional learning performance-based goals are implicitly and explicitly embedded into the curriculum design, framing part of what students are expected to learn. So for example, the collaborative model of our curriculum supports our students in developing communication and relationship skills to ensure that students feel this sense of belonging in science. And we ensure that our students' funds of knowledge are leveraged in the learning of and doing science as they develop their identities and ownership of their learning. Our units are meant to be adapted for the context of the classrooms and communities to make school science authentic to students' lives. So when part of our curriculum research project was to design and enact an efficacy study where we compared 23 treatment schools and 23 control schools that were using another curricula or science instruction model. So this curriculum, with the embedded social-emotional learning goals, yielded two positive outcomes. One being a higher science scores on the state test items and a more positive result on the social-emotional survey given to students. So that was really exciting to see. And when we controlled for reading scores, we found that even our lowest readers significantly outperformed their counterparts in the control group on the state science test. So if you look closely, you can even see that those lowest readers also outperformed the average readers on that science test. And in fact, these results remain true when we controlled for gender, race, socioeconomic status, and math benchmark scores as well. So the treatment group consistently outperformed the control group by an 8% margin on that state science test. And this data is really exciting for us as curriculum designers because you don't necessarily get those kinds of results from an efficacy study.
Yeah, Corey, it's awesome that we're seeing those increased science scores, increased reading scores. What were you hearing from the teachers using this curriculum with their students about that connection?
Yeah, so we talk with teachers all the time, and I think there's a couple on the call here. So they could probably share some things too. But so teachers are really finding that motivation, engagement in science is increasing. They're also noticing that students are more excited to read because part of this figuring out process is, or the sense making is to do some reading, right? And so Anecdotally, we see reading scores improving, and so we just have really positive results from teachers.
That's awesome. So we'll switch over and we'll talk a little bit about what YES is and our framework. So similarly to the way that CREATE and the MLPBL team have thought about equity and socio-emotional learning, so has the YES team. And so at the core of all of these curricular resources, for those of you who are not new to our webinars or our curriculum, you've seen this a few times before. We think about an equity-oriented engineering learning. And so we think about authentic engineering practices and asset-based pedagogies, development of an engineering identity through engagement with the curriculum. And then the one that we're going to look at specifically here, because it's relevant to our socio-emotional learning, is this idea of a socially engaged engineering. And so we break that down when we're thinking about what does this mean in the curriculum. They're all important, but this helps the students to develop their socio-emotional skills. So in each design challenge, we aim to situate the problem in a societal context, which we do through either a comic or a story or a video, depending on their developmental age, and consider the impacts of the problem and think critically about the impact of the engineered solutions. So let's dive a little deeper into what it means to consider the impacts of the problem in developmentally appropriate ways. There she is. Okay, hold on a second. Let me pause her. We're not ready for you yet. So we don't expect students to solve climate change in kindergarten, but they can develop the skills that will enable them to wrestle with engineering solutions for these more large-scale, systemic, and wicked problems later in life. We see here our learning trajectory for this aspect of socially engaged engineering. In grades K2, we're just looking for students to think about the needs of people other than themselves and recognize that design solutions may need to meet the needs of more than one user. So we're going to hear from a first grader who is engaging in our first grade unit, which is designing a nightlight. Let me back her up for a second. All right, hopefully you can all hear her.
So I chose this one because it's the lightest, but we can still use both because if the person isn't that scared of the dark anymore, they could flip it upside down so the light is here and then it'll just shine here. But if they're really scared of the dark, they can go it like that and then it'll be like that.
So again, may not be a new video for those of you that have been here with us before, but we hear her consider that there are some people who need more light than others and that their needs may change over time, but the design will work for those different users and their needs. Another key piece of the framework is the engineering practices. And so these are based in research with professional engineers and engineering educators, and they're embedded in the design challenges to help students develop these specific skills and mindsets. Many of them also support socio-emotional learning, right? Communicating, persisting through failure, using a structured problem-solving process.
So, Katie, when I look at these practices, I see that not all of them are necessarily specific to engineering, like persisting through failure and communicating effectively. So how do you see that transferring to other subject areas throughout the day as teachers are using these materials?
Yeah, a lot of the feedback that we heard, especially over the last year, from our 3rd and 4th grade teachers. So this would be kind of we would call them our COVID babies. They are the kids who were in kindergarten, 1st grade when COVID hit, and they didn't get to that point, right, where they got to really engage. And so these 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers who worked with us at the end of last year said, can I do this again and next year and start with this? Because what they saw was, regardless of what subject area they were in, their students were talking to each other better. They were collaborating and communicating better. And they were persisting through failures, not just in an engineering design challenge, but when they came across a content area that they didn't know how to answer, right? When they came across a question, they went and they figured it out. And they really thought about how to work on their own and have a little more independence in terms of their own learning and really work through their problems instead of looking for somebody else to solve them. So teachers were really excited to start with an engineering design challenge from YES the following year to set that up instead of having it happen for them in April and May.
Right. What a nice way to build that classroom culture that we so
Yeah.
need, right, to succeed in our school year.
Yeah, and we'll get to see video in a little bit of a of some of that failure happening and the persistence that happens.
Oh, great. Awesome.
There we go.
So between the science, the social emotional learning, and the engineering, we see a lot of things we expect students to know and to be able to do. There's just all of this to do before we even get to the content. So we think there's a lot of overlap in these practices and mindset. So we move now to thinking about how these practices and mindsets overlap and how we can support these in science and engineering through the MLPBL and YES curricula. So through our careful analysis and lots of classroom observations, we've crosswalked these practices and mindsets to make this more manageable and easier to think about how STEM and social emotional learning can work together in support of each other. So we're going to take a look at each of the 5 aspects of the CASEL framework and the practices from NGSS and YES that work in tandem with them. So you can kind of see the overview here, and then we'll go through kind of each one with some examples.
Each row, yeah. There we go.
So we'll start with self-awareness. And in multiple literacies and project-based learning, students get to choose what is important for themselves by asking meaningful questions after their experience with the phenomenon. So in this picture, you see of the driving question board, students spend time observing the birds in their neighborhood and then figure out how they can help those birds grow up and thrive. So they collect their questions on this driving question board, and these questions guide the unit and the learning as the teacher facilitates their answering of their questions and building of bird feeders or bird houses.
So, Corey, one of the things that I always struggled with in the classroom was getting students out of that mindset of being the question answerer and moving into that role of question asker, right? Because we spend a lot of time in schools preparing them to answer test questions. And now we're saying, you answer the questions, right? So what have you seen teachers doing in the classroom to support students in moving into that question asker role?
Right. So that is one of the most difficult things to do because our students are almost conditioned to, when we give them a question like, how can we help the birds around our school to grow up and thrive? All they want immediately, they want to be, well, we can do this and this and this and this. Well, right, but you can't do that until you know some more things, right? So we have to take a step back and think about what don't we know. So, you know, the KWL chart that we see a lot in classrooms is a good way to do this. So students can get all those ideas out, but then they really have to think about, well, what don't we know and what questions do we have? Another scaffold that we see teachers doing is going to their observations. For example, one of the observations might be, I see this bird digging in the dirt or something, right? And so then we help students change their observations into questions. So I see them digging in the dirt, but the question might be, what is the bird looking for in the dirt, right? And so if we can turn our observations into questions, we can put those questions on the driving question board so we can figure more things out.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So let's talk about engineering and self-awareness. In engineering, students gain this self-awareness as they develop their engineering identity and persist and learn from failure. These are both really key pieces of helping our students to access engineering. And so we're going to watch a video right here of 3 third-grade students who have been designing a system to open a door for stray dogs to access food using magnets. Let the dogs in, keep all the rats out and away from the food. And in their post-unit reflection, the teacher had them make little video reflections, and she was grateful. We were grateful for her to share them with us. The students are going to discuss their experience with failure, so I'll let them tell you.
First, we failed a lot, but we learned from failing. So first we had this magnet right here on this side, and we couldn't get it open because it was too strong. And we were like, huh, what will work? And we saw some other groups, we were like, that kind of gave us inspiration. So we were like, okay, let's try that. And it really worked. Even when we failed, we never gave up and we kept trying. And we're proud that we are engineers now and we know a lot of stuff. I'm most proud of it actually worked and we failed and we actually did it again. We never learned from our mistakes.
So over the course of the unit, the students became more resilient. The teacher in the classroom was testing this unit. And again, she's the one that said, can I start with this next year? Because of this development of persistence and self-awareness that they developed by working through these problems.
So Katie, when I think about my own classroom and even my own children at the moment, failing or failure is often a word that has so much negative meaning, whether it be in school or even in sports or, so how long does it take for these students to become okay with failure and not giving up? And how does the teacher kind of support that transition?
It is surprisingly easy for them to get this idea. And I think a big part of it is that they understand very quickly the way that the units are laid out. They're going to get a chance to improve, that they're not going to circle answer C and move on, and that's the end of the conversation. We see how many times, I don't know if you realize how many camera angles that we come to where we see these kids with this box here. This was repetitive over and over and over of what combination of magnets do I need to put together in order to make this system work? And so because they knew that they were going to get to come back to it and try again, they also knew that they could, as she said, they looked at what other groups were doing. They weren't on their own. They were working collaboratively within their group and then between groups too to get ideas. We do often hear kids are saying they're copying me, and it's no, they're not they are, right? But this is one of those cases where imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and that you're allowed to pull ideas from other people and make your design better because it's not a competition. And I think getting that through to kids does happen in the 9 lessons that this takes, that there is that change of mindset as they go through.
Yeah. We have a comment in the chat. It says, I think we need to teach without using the word failure. An attempt produces results that can help direct you in a productive direction. That's not a failure, even though it didn't do what was desired on the first attempt. I think that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think it's about demonizing the word failure.
Yeah.
That it's a failed attempt. You are not a failure, and separating out the attempt from the individual, and that failing is a learning opportunity that's inherent in the engineering design process. I think that's the key differential there is getting that word failure to stop meaning end point, I have failed.
Right. And if we're thinking about authentic learning for students, right? In the real science world, we have lots of failed attempts, right? That we need to try again. So bringing that into the conversation too, is that this is real world science. We have failed attempts, but we also collaborate with others in other groups to make our work better. All that collaborative work is not cheating. It's working, right?
Yes. It's learning from each other and growing.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move to self-management. Engaging students in both scientific investigations and engineering problem solving helps with their self-management by having steps or actions that they should include, or scaffolding students' creation of the series of steps that they will use in a particular investigation. For example, here on the left, you see students in 3rd grade working on answering their own question of how do different surfaces affect how my toy moves. Here, the teacher facilitated the students in designing an investigation to test the friction caused by different surfaces, because they are designing and building their own moving toys. So they have to test the friction so that they could kind of revise their prototype and make their toy better.
Yeah. And so engineering, we use what we call a structured problem solving process. We use the engineering design process. And so in this video, we have some fourth grade students reflecting on the engineering design process, shaped as a wheel in yes, that's important when you listen to the video to understand. And she's telling you how it supported her design of a rescue shovel.
Helped me a lot because you first like it's like the wheel and you get the fast of the steps by steps, and if first you ask and you don't understand something, you ask and then you imagine what you're gonna do. It's like science class first with other people. The first time I got it like a lot of ideas. I got like, what if we could swing? No, what if we could do? We had a lot of ideas. Then I draw them like almost all of them.
And so we see her really talking about how that process was helpful to her to get her ideas out and to really think about how she needs to go about solving this problem.
Yeah, Katie, when we work with teachers, we've tried to move away from the linear standardized scientific method. So how are structured problem solving processes different than the scientific method that we've all learned before?
Yeah, I was a science fair kid growing up, right? And we had to have these very specific things. And you went down that scientific method and you were supposed to ask a question. And then you were hypothesizing. And then you came up with a design. And then you put out your results, right? And that's not how science works. What we've done with the engineering design process is we've given them a structured set of steps that are involved in designing something to solve a problem, but they know that it's not going to be linear, that they might be asking and they might imagine, and then once they get into creating, they realize quickly like, oh, that doesn't work. I need to go back and ask. They know that they're going to get to that improve and they're going to have to come back around again and really think about, okay, what could work? So it's this idea of demystifying this process of being something so static, as you said, and limited and linear, to this more authentic version of what it means to do science and engineering, which is really playing, right? Like it's structured. You can't just do whatever. You can't just grab the materials and build something. You do need to have a plan. You do need to think about what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. But there's play in the process and there's a little bit of fluidity and movement back and forth to make sure that we get to a really good design.
Yeah, I think that overlaps nicely with the next one, right? So in order to have self-management skills, we need to think about responsible decision making, and like we have to make responsible decisions in our investigations, but also as we analyze and interpret our data. So in the unit where students are helping the birds in their neighborhood, they have to analyze and use the data to make responsible decisions about this bird feeder that they're creating to meet the needs of the birds they chose to focus on. So you can see here kind of the student notebook page that they use to kind of design their bird feeder. And students are able to choose different birds based on what they saw in their community as a need. One group chose ducks and had to make a decision about where and what would be best for ducks in their bird feeder, hence why you see the pool on the ground. And the picture on the right is just another example of a bird feeder built by third graders.
So sometimes it can be really hard to adapt and allow students to lead the way in this decision making. What strategies did you see teachers use to guide without telling in this process?
Yeah, it's really nice to see teachers kind of just let students, like we talked about before, like make decisions that maybe they end up realizing are not the right ones, right? For example, two things. One group, or we've had groups of students choose a turkey vulture as their bird. And so if you think about what a turkey vulture,
what are they putting in that bird feeder?
Exactly, right? And so when they go to, build this bird feeder and they realize oh my gosh, I'm gonna need some roadkill or, you know, animal carcasses to feed this bird, they realize, okay, that's not a responsible decision or an ethical decision I need to be making. Maybe I can't help that bird, right? So then they have to pivot and choose another one. Another example, a group wanted to build this bird feeder and they brought in this cardboard cereal box. And so they build this bird feeder out of this cardboard box. And this particular year that I'm thinking about, it was like the rainiest season in Michigan that we have had in the last 20 years, right? And the teacher absolutely knew that this bird feeder would get demolished, right?
Disintegrate. Yeah.
Not going to work. So, but she just had to, she kind of just, all right,
Let them fail.
let's see what happens. Let's see what data you can collect, and let's see how you're going to revise after your test run, which they ended up using a milk carton and the soda bottle, I think that you see in that picture there. So
yeah, seems to be working a little bit better, less
Yeah.
deterioration.
Yes.
We have similar practices in engineering too, right? Making evidence-based decisions, balancing criteria and constraints, and envisioning multiple solutions, right? So what we're thinking about here is that they need to think about what evidence they have so that they can balance those criteria and constraints that are either set by the users, the availability of materials, the budget, the timeline, and then envision multiple solutions to allow them to have different designs to choose from, using evidence to decide which one best meets those criteria and constraints. And so we're going to see a video here quickly of students trying to make a decision about which material would make a good handle for a hand pollinator. So think about something that's going to transfer pollen from one flower to the next to artificially pollinate flowers where there's a lack of bees. So we're going to ask you to kind of get a little interactive with us on this one. And so listen for what are the different aspects they consider as they make their decision. What things are they considering as they're doing this? And drop them in the chat. Tell us who or what you're hearing them use in making that decision.
Well, I think the coffee stirrer and the cheesecake was a tie. Yeah, it's so small. You might actually, my dad would accidentally drop it just to get in there. Yeah, so you have to think about that. But look, when you do these two, that's way bigger.
So if you're hearing things, what were they considering? You can drop those in the chat for us, and we can chat about those for a second.
Yeah, as you're typing, I'm really impressed with how so you said these are second graders?
Second graders.
Yeah. So how much experience do they need? Like, how much talking like this do they do, or have they, like, how long does it take for these students to learn to communicate this way, right? Like, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I will first of all say that they are an exceptional group of second graders, right? I think this is really exemplary talk from kids this young. When I've talked to the teacher about this, and I'm like, how did you get them to do this? Being very humble, I think she didn't have quite an answer for me. She was just like, that's kind of how they are. But I think when we're hearing this a lot of times, not necessarily in this context, but in others, there's some talk prompts built into the curriculum. So they have their engineering notebooks, you see them in front of them. And a lot of times there's little sentence starters to get them going so that they have an idea of what kind of questions to ask one another, how they can push back on one another. So sometimes when I'm seeing video and I'm watching it back, right, and we're looking at these small groups where there's not an adult kind of hovering over them, and they're being more authentic as second graders, we start to hear things that maybe we don't normally hear when the adult's standing nearby. And so sometimes we'll be listening and I will realize they are literally reading these little sentence stems from the engineering notebook to get themselves going. And it really does seem to help them have much more civilized discourse, for lack of a better term. There's less, we're arguing here. This is the kind of arguing that we want, but it's not destructive arguing, right? They're not yelling at each other. They're getting at it, right? They are adamant in how they feel about things. But they're being respectful of each other and arguing with evidence, not just arguing for one that they like the best.
Yeah. In the chat, we have, they were visibly comparing physical properties, which is nicely aligned to NGSS performance expectations in second grade, which is amazing. David said it's very promising and that he's wondering what early experiences are needed to prepare students to do this.
Yeah, so this is about halfway through the 9-lesson unit. And so I think what really works well is we are taking it piece by piece of the different components of this hand pollinator. And so they have some tools that they are using in their notebook to think about and really highlight that kind of evidence. So in this particular instance, if you can see the little girl's notebook right there in the front, you can see some descending sized circles. And so those are meant so that they can take those various materials for the handle and touch them to that circle. And how easy is it to hit that target with that? So in one of the options that they have is like a pipe cleaner. It's sort of flimsy. It kind of moves around a little bit. The little boy in the back is arguing for the toothpick because it is really easy for him to get right in there because it's very stiff. So that's, I think, is one of those pieces that kind of allows them to really get into that discussion with each other, is that there's a really clear visual in front of them to reference. And they also, what you're seeing in the bottom of that page is pictures of the different materials as well. So David's saying he's glad, Samuel, sorry, is saying he's glad his students did this project of preparing a hand pollinator. Yes, so Samuel's is, yes, there are 2 versions of building a hand pollinator in the Yes and EIE family. So this video is actually, the handle material was added in the newest update that's part of the Yes materials. So that was not originally part of the unit, but yes, Mariana Becomes a Butterfly is a great context setting story that we used originally with these hand pollinator units. I'm going to try and move the slide now without playing the video again. Oh, doesn't want to do it. All right, Corey, tell us about relationship skills.
Thanks. So relationship skills are kind of what we've been talking about in terms of communication and collaboration and all those things. In the multiple literacies curriculum, like students need to work together to build consensus models, which you'll see a little picture there of a rocket. When students are designing their toys, they need to be able to use the same language or same symbols and labels in their models to identify forces. And so first, they have to agree on that language, right? They have to work together to define the language and pick the symbols, which is really difficult to do. And in the second picture, you see students sharing their ideas about birds. They had to categorize their birds into groups that they've chosen, and they have to give evidence and reasoning for those decisions while classmates asked questions and maybe pushed back a little bit on their explanations. So in our curriculum, what we've done is embed these discourse moves to support teachers in facilitating that building of relationship skills and that communication. So the discourse moves are in each lesson with some sample prompts that teachers can use in their adapting and planning for their lessons.
That's awesome. So that collaborative teamwork in engineering is where we really see that engineering design process come to life. You could give these tasks to kids. I think both in MLPBL and in Yes, you could give them to kids to do by themselves. But what really makes these powerful is this collaborative process. And setting the stage for that collaboration starts in kindergarten. My dad always used to ask my siblings and I, did you learn sharing today? And like, he was right. That was the key thing we needed to be walking away with, more than the reading and the math skills, but was how to interact and share with each other. So it's helping them they're not even only sharing materials here, they're sharing ideas and they're helping each other to overcome obstacles. Um, and they're kindergartners and they can do it. So we're going to listen in on this little group of kindergartners, and they're working on designing a sun hat that is to help them keep cool or stop them from being uncomfortable. And that's a big vocabulary word in this unit.
Yeah, make a big bridge. Guys, look at how you really did it. We're ready to make a big bridge. I don't know how to make that. Can I help you?
So again, like I said, when we walk away, these beautiful things happen. I had spent a lot of time with this group in the classroom, and watching the video back of them after this is like, there's so many gorgeous things that they're saying to each other when an adult's not standing there supervising them. We can let them be themselves and interact. So we see Elias, this little boy in the front with the dark hair, was sharing his own ideas and helping his peers stay on task. We're building a brim. This is a big brim, and this is what it should look like. But they needed to develop at building strong relationships with his peers in the process, right? He showed the little girl, let him be a leader. He got to show and help. So we have these really strong relationship skills being built.
Yeah. Katie, when I think about kindergarten and these kindergartners, right? And it being such a foundational year in school, like, and there's already so much pressure on kindergarten teachers. How can we build this kind of work into such a packed kindergarten schedule when there's already so much pressure?
Yeah, I think the key piece here is that there's a lot of literacy and math built into these curricular resources. So there is an engineering notebook, there is writing practice in it. They are using counting skills. They are talking about shapes, right? There are these pieces that are aligned with math and reading in there. We've also designed them to be shorter. The lower the grade, the shorter the lesson is. So 30 minutes, 9 lessons, and they've gone through the entire engineering design process and built a sun hat that they can wear and they will parade around the school in and be really proud of themselves. So it doesn't take a huge chunk of the day, doesn't take a huge chunk of the year, right? You could do this 3 days a week for 3 weeks and you'd have an entire engineering unit done. So I think it's just finding the time because it really is helping to reinforce kids' interpersonal skills and community building.
Yeah, and I think what you've said about doing science isn't taking away from math and
Yes.
ELA, right? Like we have to use our literacy skills in order to be successful in science, right? But not doing science takes away from literacy
From doing science.
and
Yes.
ELA, right? So adding this and science and engineering into the kindergarten schedule can be impactful in many different ways.
Right, across the content areas.
Yes.
All right, we're gonna try again. There we go. Oh, look at that one. That one worked. So the last of these CASEL framework pieces is social awareness. And so YES really does a nice job of really thinking about that socially engaged, right? That's built into the curriculum. We're thinking about students being able to think about real world problems. And so to support this, one scaffolder tool that we have is that we've created these comics, as you see here. In younger grades, it's a read aloud story. In older grades, there's videos of real life scientists that contextualize the problem and introduce the design challenge. And so here we see lots of pieces from our 5th grade unit, engineering plastic filters. They're thinking about who is most and least harmed by pollution in this bay that the comic characters live near. And they're also thinking about the use of plastic, how it's helpful in some settings, such as wrapping food, but is also problematic in creating pollution in the bay. And they use this information to make informed decisions as they design their plastic filter to help those most impacted in the bay and choose materials that solve the problem but don't do more harm to the bay and its human and non-human users. Now, social awareness doesn't directly correlate with a specific next generation science and engineering practice, but Corey's going to talk about that in just a second.
Yeah, so we see this big old empty box of in the social awareness section that, so it may not look like it lines exactly with the practices, but the framework for K-12 science education says that when people enter into the practices of science or engineering, they do not leave their cultural worldviews at the door. An instruction that fails to recognize this reality can adversely affect student engagement in science. So we should allow science and science understanding to grow out of lived experiences. So MLPBL tends to this by those embedded equity goals that we've talked about before, embedding them into the curriculum design. So we tend to social issues in our curriculum like food deserts, the Flint water crisis, and we encourage teachers to adapt the curriculum to be critical and challenge inequities in their communities. So there are also practices that we don't see in direct alignment with the CASEL framework. And so in the next slide, we'll look at those a little bit more directly. So,
yep, go for it.
So on the left, we see like developing and using models, using mathematics and computational thinking, and constructing explanations and design solutions. Like, we didn't see them directly align, but they do align because you can't develop a model, right, until you ask questions and plan and carry out an investigation and interpret and analyze data, all like supported by our social emotional learning of self-awareness, responsible decision-making, right? So
yeah, social
emotional learning supports STEM, but STEM can also be reciprocal and support social emotional learning.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is these outside ones really being these disciplinary specific things, right? The models and prototypes, that's a science and that's a STEM thing, right? Exploring properties and uses of materials, using mathematics and computational thinking, right? Really using those math and science. Maybe at first doesn't look like that, but you can't do the other things without doing that. You can't do those applying science and math if you haven't really thought about what you're applying it to. And so I think it's really easy to decontextualize science and engineering, right? We can have kids build the tallest tower and they'll hit a lot of these things, but if we don't contextualize it, we don't give it a real world problem, I think is when we start to see like it lose some of that SEL. So I think those contextualizations and real world problems that we see in both the YES framework and the MLPBL framework is really kind of critical to how we're arriving at these socio-emotional learning goals with MLPBL and YES. So we'll slide over to our last slide. We promised we'd show you how to get to the open access curricular resources. So there's a lot on here. Sorry, there's a lot going on at once. You have both mine and Corey's contact information. So if you had questions you wanted to follow up with either of us directly, and then there's some links and QR codes for you to get to our different curricular resources. Corey, do you want to talk about the three on your side?
Yeah, so Sprocket is the open education resource, a link. So you can find all of the curriculum there and find lesson plans, storylines, all the things are there too, including student worksheets and things. ECA is a service in Michigan who puts together teacher kits. So if you're looking for a kit aligned to the curriculum, they're the people to contact. The material lists are included in Sprocket. So if you want to go and purchase your own materials, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And then Collaborate Science is a part of Accelerate Learning, which houses STEM Scope. And then they have a Collaborate Science arm, which is essentially MLPBL, but they're offering the curriculum with additional digital and print materials. It is it is a fee for service, and they offer professional learning too. So they have purchased the license to the curriculum. So they're offering it as well if you are looking for a little bit more support there. And then, yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah. So similarly to what Corey said, you can get to our resource if you go to yes@mos.org. You can get directly to those curricular resources. You click on the curriculum tab, click the grade band that you're interested in, elementary, middle school, or an out of school. And then you can click on any unit and you're able to download it for free. But likewise, you can also purchase the kit materials. So the list of materials you need, again, is in the curriculum, but we can also just send you a box of stuff and then it's ready to go. The QR code and the longer web address there will take you to some upcoming events with MOS.